The True History of Joseph Merrick, also known as the Elephant Man, 1862 to 1890, by Jeanette Sitton and Audrey Kantrovitz. Joseph Merrick was born in 1862 and died in 1890. He first became widely known through the Elephant Man film, directed by David Lynch, released in 1980. He was a real person, not a fictitious character, and his deformity was accurately portrayed in the film. Except for his first name, he was never called John, his real name was Joseph. Joseph is remembered for his physical appearance, but those close to him spoke of his kind and gentle nature. The early years. From birth to 10 years, he lived with his mother, Mary Jane, and his father, Joseph Rockley Merrick, in Lee Street, a slum area of Leicester. There were no signs of his deformity at birth, and despite a smallpox epidemic at the time, he grew as a healthy child. He began to show symptoms of his disfigurement when he was a year old. It began as a small swelling inside his upper lip. Being much simpler times, his mother thought his condition came from a fright she experienced when almost trampled by a parading elephant during the 6th month of her pregnancy. Now aged 4, Joseph suffered a fall, injuring his left hip joint. The joint became diseased and left him permanently disabled. Mary Jane had 2 other children, neither of them sharing their brother's condition. Despite Joseph's deteriorating appearance, he went to school like other children, and also as a Baptist attended Sunday school, where he learned to read and write. It is here that he developed his lifelong Christian faith. The most devastating event of Joseph's life was when his mother died. He was 10 years old, and this was a constant upset to him. Working days. Joseph's father remarried. The wife showed no compassion whatsoever towards her stepson and issued him an ultimatum of basically find work or go without food. After a long search, Joseph found a job at Messrs. Freeman's cigar factory. He rolled tobacco leaves into cigars. He worked there for 2 years, but because of the increasing size and weight of his right arm, he wasn't able to roll the leaves with the delicate and precise touch needed for the job. Facing destitution, with no other options open to him, Joseph's father gave him a job hawking goods, such as bootblack and haberdashery, shoelaces, buttons. He could barely walk and was unable to escape the ridiculing crowds that would follow him from door to door. It was now getting progressively harder for Joseph to meet his daily quota of sales. His father would beat him for no other reason than taking a little of the money each day to feed himself. One day, following a particularly harsh beating, the 15-year-old Joseph ran away from home. He knew he could never return. It would seem his father didn't bother looking for him. Destitute, homeless and starving, Joseph was losing all sight of hope. It was around this time that his uncle, Charles Barnabas Merrick, found him and took him in. He had finally found a safe harbour. The workhouse. He lived with Charles for 2 years, hawking what he could, contributing towards his keep. He was happy living with his aunt and uncle. Unfortunately, the disfiguring condition continued to advance. The growing distortion of his mouth made it hard for him to speak and be understood. Wherever Joseph went, gawkers were sure to follow. When it came time to renew his hawker's licence, it was turned down. Denied a means of supporting himself, the only option left was to sign himself into the dreaded workhouse. Joseph was 17 when he entered the Leicester Union Workhouse. To earn his keep, he was given the job of picking oakum, separating the strands of old rope. This was a painful and tedious task. In exchange for this work, which would have taken all day, he received Spartan lodging and 3 servings of swill. After just 12 weeks, Joseph left the workhouse, desperately looking for a job, but after only 2 days and famished, he had to return, remaining for a further 4 years. By halfway through his stay, a trunk-like growth on his upper jaw had grown to roughly 8 inches in length, making it impossible for him to eat. Surgery was inevitable, cutting away 3 or 4 ounces of flesh. This was carried out in the workhouse's own infirmary. The Freak Show. Unable to tolerate workhouse life any longer, Joseph sought the only form of employment left open to him. He decided to work as a sideshow freak. He wrote a letter to Sam Torr, the owner of the Leicester-based music hall, who later visited him at the workhouse. Torr signed him up as a novelty straight away. He toured a selection of towns with the show, wearing a concealing veiled hat and a long black cloak when in public. His stage name was the Elephant Man. Although the police were constantly moving the show on, Joseph was successful and earned more than ever before. He travelled to London with the show, and while there, Frederick Treves, the renowned surgeon of the London Hospital at Whitechapel, came to know of the Elephant Man through his colleagues. They persuaded him to go and see the exhibition for himself. Following the viewing, Treves examined Joseph at the medical college close to the hospital. He agreed to be presented at the Pathological Society of London on the 2nd of December 1884. Afterwards he returned to the sideshow. With Britain no longer tolerating freak shows due to changing moral standards, Joseph's manager tried the continent, unaware that the people of Europe had become just as intolerant. Escape to the continent. The tour was a failure. The manager realised he could make little profit with Joseph, so he abandoned him in Belgium and stole every last halfpenny of his savings, totalling £50. Alone in a foreign country, Joseph pawned nearly all his belongings to get back home. Now exhausted, he managed to get passage on a steamer and cross the Channel to Harwich. From there, he caught a train to London's Liverpool Street. Although he had experienced aggressive crowds in the past, nothing had prepared him for what was yet to come. Back home. Malnourished and ill from chronic bronchitis, Joseph dragged himself heavily onto the platform at London's Liverpool Street station. Dressed in his formalist disguise, he unwittingly attracted the attention of the curious. A crowd swarmed around him, grabbing at his hat and his cloak in an attempt to uncover him. The police intervened, forcing back the marauding crowds. They escorted Joseph to an empty third-class waiting room. He collapsed in a heap on the floor. His unblemished hand fumbled in his pocket and produced a card. It was the business card of Dr. Frederick Treves at the London hospital. A policeman examined the card, perhaps astonished at the association between the poor man on the floor and such an esteemed surgeon. Mr. Treves was immediately sent for. When Treves arrived, he had to push his way through the crowd to reach the waiting room. The last time he saw Joseph was 2 years ago, but recognised the huddled-up man instantly. With the help of the police, the doctor escorted him to a waiting horse-drawn cab. Joseph sagged into the seat and fell into a deep slumber. He slept all the way to the hospital. The London hospital. Taken to a private room in the isolation ward in the hospital's attic, Joseph was then bathed, put to bed, and fell asleep. The maid bringing up his food wasn't forewarned. She took one look, screamed, dropped the tray, and fled the room. Joseph was kept in the isolation ward for several months under the watchful eye of Mr. Treves and the nurses, though his presence didn't say a secret for long. As an incurable case, Joseph couldn't stay long term, though it was agreed that neither would he be thrown out. Not knowing what to do, the chairman, Mr. Carey, wrote a letter to the Times newspaper for suggestions. He previously contacted British Home and the Royal Hospital for Incurables, but was denied on both counts. Instead of only receiving suggestions from Times readers, the hospital was swamped with donations. The hospital decided that he would stay. Joseph finally had a home of his own. At the back of the hospital there were 2 small vacant rooms used for repairing bedsteads or frames. The area was called Bedstead Square. After some refurbishment, they became an excellent permanent home for Joseph. Now settled in, his doctor arranged visits with people from outside the hospital to show that both men and women could accept him. Treves invited a young lady friend, who he introduced to Joseph. She was instructed to smile, wish him good morning, and shake his hand. The experience was overwhelming to him. He wept uncontrollably, and when asked why, he said, this was the first woman who had ever smiled at him, and the first woman in the whole of his life who had shaken hands with him. Despite his reaction, the visit was successful. From that moment on, he was comfortable in female company. Over time, more people came, increasing Joseph's confidence. Joseph's popularity. It soon became fashionable for the upper echelons to visit the Elephant Man. Setting the trend was Princess Alexandra, the future Queen of England. One of his benefactors, the actress Madge Kendall, arranged for him to go to the theatre to see Puss in Boots. Joseph was exhilarated by the whole experience, and he would talk of it for weeks as if it were real and not make-believe. Besides his trips to the theatre, he was also given holidays in the countryside, where he was able to walk freely in the daylight without his disguise. These were arranged by one of his visitors. Failing health. Joseph's condition continued to deteriorate. He had also developed a heart condition, and his episodes of bronchitis became more frequent. Nothing could be done. It is believed that Joseph's condition may have been a result of Proteus syndrome or neurofibromatosis. His case is the most severe ever known. Proteus syndrome is extremely rare, causing overgrowth of bone to grow upon existing bone. As for neurofibromatosis, it's hereditary and more common, causing benign tumours to grow around nerve endings. Joseph dies. Friday, April 11th, 1890. A nurse checked in on Joseph. He was still in bed, but appeared well. Later on he was brought his lunch, but he didn't touch it. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Treves, a house surgeon, dropped by, but found Joseph laying across his bed, and saw at once that he was dead. A combination of the weight of his head, cutting off air supply, and a weakened heart. After a brief funeral service, the body was handed over to the hospital authorities. Samples were taken, plaster moulds made, and the skeleton articulated. About the disfigurement. Head, 36 inches around, covered in excess bone and skin. Severe disfigurement of the face caused by bony masses. Right arm, 12 inches around the wrist, reaching down to the knee. Largest finger measuring 5 inches around. Spine, corkscrew curvature. Left hip joint, no ball and socket joint. Right leg, excessive thickness of lower thigh bone. Skin, overgrown and thickened, needing frequent bathing. Legacy. Joseph's story of courage continues to touch and inspire people today. The Joseph Merrick Tribute website by Jeanette Sitton was built in 1995, and since 2004 it has received over 160,000 visitors. Such is the strength of Joseph's message. The Friends of Joseph Merrick, also known as the Joseph Merrick Foundation, is responsible for keeping his inspiring story alive and is one of strength, bravery and endurance of the human spirit. The Friends. We have friends worldwide, in many continents. Jerry Clark, Australia. Jeff Timmons, Canada. Stephen Thompson, Japan. Holly Mayer, New Zealand. Myself in the UK. Dr. Angela Lennox, CBE, also in the UK. In the United States, there are many fans of Joseph Merrick. Audrey Controwitz, Brooke Scoville, Christine Reeder, May Strachane, Rebecca Timmons. Huge following in the United States. I'd like to thank you. I apologise for any fumbles and miswords, but I had to say this very quickly because YouTube only lets you have a certain amount of time. So I do apologise for that. I hope you found this interesting. Thank you very much for listening.